is surveillance. People watching other people, trying to learn who their friends are, where they travel, how much they make, but mostly what they think. Political surveillance. This report was filmed in Philadelphia, but it could be about people living anywhere. People like these, being photographed as they leave a courthouse. Or this 15-year-old schoolboy whose letters to his parents became part of an FBI file. Or these veterans laying a memorial wreath, watched by a police plainclothesman whose notes will go into dossiers. Or this minister, he and his church under continual surveillance by the police and the FBI. Or this girl, the daughter of a congressman, subject of a security investigation no one can explain. Some are young and radical, like this woman being watched by the FBI. Others are older and members of the establishment, like the former mayor of the country's fourth largest city. Many are not even involved in politics, just ordinary people who are subjected to investigations into their personal affairs, even their morals, when they buy insurance or apply for credit or look for a job. They and you have been, or may be, under surveillance.
CBS reports. Under surveillance. With CBS News correspondent David Shoemaker. This broadcast is sponsored by the Shell Oil Company. Shell is trying to make things better. And by Cascade, for dishes with a beautiful Cascade look. Here again is David Shoemaker.
Sarah Forth goes to work most days just before 9. Neither she nor her job is very typical. Earlier this year, her husband was in jail for destroying draft records, and she works every day for radical causes like the Berrigan case. Not typical, but then not very different from many young people today. Certainly not someone you'd notice walking down the street. There are men, though, who do. Many mornings, they wait in this car for her to walk by. If she changes her route, they or other men seem to know. And there's generally someone waiting and watching. Sarah Forth is not afraid, because she decided long ago the men watching her are agents of the FBI, and they're performing the most basic kind of surveillance, the stakeout. For 5 days, as the FBI watched Sarah Forth, we watched the FBI. The cars were generally the same. The agents sometimes rotated. Despite what you may have heard about buttoned-down FBI agents, a few wore beards, a few were black. Each day after she passed, the men in the car would make a radio call and then pull away. Good evening, I'm David Shoemaker. The surveillance of Sarah Forth may or may not be warranted. Law enforcement officials say if they're to maintain order, they must watch dissenters who may provoke disturbances. Others say the government has no right to spy on someone who's not broken the law, and fear that individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution, which was written here, are in jeopardy. The argument often comes down to novelist George Orwell's vision of 1984, of a system of surveillance and thought control terrifying in the original, but updated now with sophisticated monitoring devices and computers. To learn whether that vision is becoming a reality, we decided to focus on one community to determine whether there is political surveillance. If there is, how much, who's doing it, how it's done, who's under suspicion, and finally, what effect it has on that community. We chose Philadelphia not because it is special, but because we believe it is typical. No better and no worse than where you live. Not far from here, there's a small townhouse on a quiet street, the home of Stuart and Charlotte Meacham. The Meachams have always been involved in liberal causes, helped plan one of those big but peaceful marches on Washington. Their friends organized it, and some met at this table.
Several of the people on the coordinating committee arrived a little ahead of time, and they phoned us here and told us they were at the airport. So Charlotte said, why don't you tell them to come on by and stay here until it's time to go to the meeting? So they did. There were 3 of them, and among them was a man named Irving Block, who represented the Veterans for Peace from Chicago. Then it wasn't until some months later that while the Chicago conspiracy trial was going on in Chicago, that we read in the paper that Irving Block had been called as a witness by the prosecution. And he testified that he was a Chicago policeman. And it was rather startling, frankly, to read in the paper that a man that we had had as a guest in our house here in Philadelphia turned out to be a Chicago policeman doing undercover police work in Philadelphia. And that was the man that came to dinner.
You're smiling today, but I take it that in your initial reactions you didn't think it was very funny.
I don't really think it's funny. I think that when we're in a situation in our country where you can't assume that whoever comes into your home comes in good faith and as a friend, then I think this is a very serious situation, and it reminds me of things that we've heard about Nazi Germany.
Perhaps the most striking thing about police surveillance in Philadelphia is its openness. At this quiet wreath-laying ceremony, for instance, with John Kerry and a few members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, 2 plainclothesmen took notes on the ceremony and the participants. Long before the Vietnam War, there were demonstrations and there was surveillance. But the war seems to have advanced the state of both arts. Demonstrators are better organized than ever. In response, many city police units have set up tactical squads which spend all their time watching the demonstrators, collecting information, and building files. In Philadelphia, the police surveillance unit is called the Civil Disobedience Squad. Using cameras, tape recorders, even closed-circuit television, they've built files on at least 18,000 individuals and 600 local organizations, a kind of who's who of Philadelphia dissenters. Demonstrators object to being photographed and cataloged, and they wonder what the government eventually may do with their pictures and files.
I think they have a right to investigate specific crimes. I don't think they have a right to say that someday somebody might commit a crime and then follow them and harass them for an indefinite period of time.
Judy Chomsky and others have filed a lawsuit trying to stop police surveillance of demonstrators. She's the leader of a radical but nonviolent organization. She's also married to a doctor and the mother of 2 children.
We're photographed, and there are files kept on us. We once applied for a permit for John F. Kennedy Plaza. It was about 2 or 3 years ago. And at that time, the Civil Disobedience Squad came into the hearing with huge dossiers on everybody and started to go through them, saying that we were, that we carried on grossly illegal activities and that we were, incorrigible and things like that. We ultimately went to federal court and enjoined the Fairmount Park Commission so that we were permitted to have the rally. The courts obviously didn't think that we were all that dangerous. But
Judy Chomsky at least knows there's a file on her. Others may not. These people, for instance, being photographed leaving the Philadelphia courthouse. Some of them, we cannot know which ones, have attended the trial of a man refusing to pay his federal income tax as a form of political protest. Apparently, that's why the photographer and the man in the raincoat have been making a careful record of them as they leave. Not some of them, but all of them. Many do not realize their picture is being taken. None can know whether that photograph will be used to start a new file under his name or be added to a file that already exists. Nor can they or we be sure just which agency is interested in them. Washington sources would only say that the 2 men are probably federal agents. Neither the FBI nor the police would talk about their surveillance activities. But Philadelphia's former police commissioner and now mayor-elect Frank Rizzo told us why he thinks surveillance is needed.
How do you cope or combat people who are bent on destroying our government, destroying our society, and not have this information available to us? You wouldn't take a knife off a butcher. You wouldn't take a scalpel off a doctor. You wouldn't take a television camera and a crew off a guy like you, that needs the tools to work with.
But those people that are demonstrating, they're not all trying to destroy the system, are they?
No. I would believe that there are many, many people who are there that feel strongly that the cause that they're protesting against is unjust. And I'm certain that if it was like, for instance, the Vietnam War, you might find a lot of policemen there with their wives and children protesting. Because I know personally hundreds of policemen who are against the war in Vietnam. But there are also other jokers who infiltrate the well-meaning people that are bent on destruction and the overthrow of this government. And I know because they are the files that I really kept in good shape. And well-meaning people who don't know the basics or the issues or what these people are desirous of doing, they are led to slaughter like sheep, you know, just like any mob.
No surveillance technique is more often discussed, but according to officials, less used in practice than wiretaps. Nevertheless, many of those who have been under surveillance are convinced their phones were tapped. Wiretaps are against the law in 32 states, including Pennsylvania. But those are state laws. Federal agencies may tap wires in all states, with either a court order or, in national security cases, the approval of the Attorney General. In both instances, the telephone company cooperates, although it claims it has strict policies to protect the public. We examine those policies with Samuel Line, Jr., an assistant vice president of Pennsylvania Bell Telephone.
We're a firm believer, and always have been historically, in the privacy of communication and the individual's right to privacy in his communication. We historically have been against wiretapping, but recognize that public policy may dictate, due to either crime considerations domestically or national security considerations, that something may have to be done.
What's the nature of the telephone company's assistance? Do you take him to the switchboard and let him go to work?
No, under no circumstances are these wiretaps performed on the premises of the telephone company.
When you say that it's not performed on the premises of the company, would it, though, be performed on telephone company property? I'm thinking of a pole or some sort of a, let's say, sub-switching station of some sort, or...
Yes, I had in particular mind our central offices. None of this is done in the central office. It's all done outside, near the premises of the customer whose communications they wish to intercept.
Do you supply the FBI with a line at the point of the tap so that they can monitor the conversations back in their office instead of out on a location?
Where such a line would be required, we are directed to so provide it.
Now, in the nature of the procedure, is the tap actually attached by a phone company employee?
No. It's attached by the agency.
He says, that's it over there, and...
That's right.
Does he supervise the placement of the tap?
No.
Do you, after they are through, go and inspect the tap to be sure that it has been attached in accordance with the court order?
No, we are sure that they follow the law, which states that we can only wiretap those facilities on which you have a court order to wiretap.
In effect, what you seem to be saying is that you trust the FBI to live up to the terms of the court order, and so should I. But if I go to the FBI and ask for information on wiretaps, I'm turned aside. Where do I go for that information?
Well, I have tried to tell you all that of the limited activities that we have in this field, which operate under our system of law, and
People who suspect their phones are tapped are forced to turn to a specialist, generally a private detective, as we did. Lou Smith has uncovered 60 taps and bugs for his clients. Electronic bugs are easily purchased, and Smith was to show on this day, easily installed. Actually, this is the home of a CBS employee who gave us permission to make this test. He told his wife only that someone might be by to look at the phone, and we filmed from the shrubbery as Smith rang the bell.
Put it down. Somebody home?
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna check the phones.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what phone he was complaining about.
I think he was talking about a phone in the house. Well, could you show me one? Any of them?
Oh.
Smith was in the house less than 10 minutes when he signaled for us to come in. Lou, how did it go in here? You were in and out pretty fast.
Very easy. I had no problems at all. I tapped 2 telephones.
2 phones? Which phones?
The kitchen unit and an extension phone in another part of the house.
The tap is actually a tiny broadcast transmitter, beaming both sides of a phone conversation to a radio receiver, a receiver we brought inside with us for this demonstration. Now, of course, you wouldn't normally have the radio in the house with the subject. How far away could you get with that?
You can get a maximum range of 2 miles.
I wonder for our skeptics if you'd prove now that the phone is tapped.
I'm calling my office. Sam, this is Lou.
Yes, sir?
All quiet?
Yes, sir.
Fine. This is the call I told you earlier I'd make. It's being monitored for demonstration purposes. No static?
No, line's all clear.
Okay, I'll check with you later.
Fine.
Right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, it obviously works. Now show me how you did it.
This is your tap. This is the mic element that belongs in there.
Not much different.
No difference at all. This phone is now debugged.
While wiretapping can be guaranteed to cause public debate, few people are aware of another surveillance technique with similar overtones, monitoring private mail, the mail cover. We talked about that with a postman who asked us to conceal his identity. In the course of your work, have you ever put a mail cover on anyone?
Yes, numerous times. Usually the supervisor will inform you that there is a watch on a particular house or individual, and they'll give you a log daily, and you're supposed to write down the name of the person that's receiving the mail, the address, and the person that sent it, and the address that it was sent from.
Did you open the mail?
No.
Does the person in these situations know that their mail is being watched?
No, not to my knowledge.
Do you feel that when you do it against someone who's not a criminal, that you're in any way invading their privacy?
Well, naturally you wonder, because some people you see them day in and day out on a route.
Sometimes you have done this. You put a mail cover on people that you like to think of as your friends.
Right. And I mean, I never, you have to wonder, so what the heck, what are they doing? They seem to be all right with me.
So far, we've examined the techniques of surveillance, the stakeout, bugs, mail covers. But those things haven't changed much in recent years. What has changed is the scope of surveillance. And that's due to the ghetto riots, the assassinations, the campus unrest of the 1960s. Several blue ribbon panels, the Warren Commission, the Kerner Commission, and the Scranton Commission, agreed on one basic conclusion. The government needed more information, intelligence, to head off trouble. So starting under a Democratic president and a liberal attorney general and continuing today, surveillance has been expanded to cover broad groups, particularly the young, the black, and the politically active. That's what we're going to look at now, beginning here in Independence Plaza. This was Earth Day 1970 in Philadelphia. A mass demonstration in which the hippies, the straights, and the politicians could get together on one issue: survival. But the people and the politicians were not alone that day. The police were there, and the FBI. Senator Edmund Muskie was to complain about that later. What he didn't know was that not only was the FBI watching, so were agents of Army intelligence. The Pentagon claims it has stopped domestic surveillance now, but one of its targets, the American Friends Service Committee, is skeptical. The committee is the social action agency of the Quakers, who are a part of the tradition and the establishment of Philadelphia. The discovery that they were in the Army's files prompted a demand for an interview with the Army's General Counsel. Bronson Clark, executive director of the committee, recalls the trip to the Pentagon.
We found the General Counsel in some state of agitation. He said, he said, we found 5 computers. Don't say a word. Don't say a word. I know just what's on your mind. There have been too many overzealous people here. We found data banks we never heard of and didn't know existed. And as a matter of fact, we've destroyed the index on one of the major data banks. Well, we said, is there a file? And he said, I'd like to answer that there isn't, but I can't be sure. We're looking.
Well, was the Pentagon's counsel fudging, or didn't he really know whether he had a file on you or not?
Well, I think they are in disarray. I didn't sense that the General Counsel of the Department of Defense had it in for the American Friends Service Committee. On the contrary, I felt I was in the presence of a harassed bureaucrat trying to ride an absolute octopus of a situation. Not a man who was conspiring against us at all, but one who would have breathed a sigh of relief if he could have really been assured that a lot of those data banks weren't there.
It was more than a year before the Army felt it could safely write a letter assuring the Friends they were no longer in the files.
Well, this is a letter from Robert E. Jordan III, who's General Counsel of the Department of the Army. And he says, since your request was directed to my attention, the file on the American Friends Service Committee was examined to determine whether it could be retained under current policy. It could not be retained and was therefore destroyed. But unfortunately, there's one whole paragraph that says, while we have destroyed the file on your organization, we can't say that about certain members, and I quote, certain members of the American Friends Service Committee at the local level were and can conceivably be of interest, investigative interest to the Army when they are engaged in activities with other organizations or individually. In other words, they say, we're going to keep track of your staff individually or committee members individually.
So they can keep track of each individual in the organization, have a code number that applies to all of them, and punch the right button on a computer and get the sum.
Get it all back again. The file comes back. It's an unsatisfactory letter from several standpoints, not the least of which, once again, we have the Army asserting the claim that it can have surveillance over civilians, which we deny. As citizens, we say, if we have committed some criminal act, well, prosecute us, take us in before a judge. We have federal judges all over the country. There's a legal system. There's no need for the Department of the Army to play judge, jury, lawyer, and the whole kit and caboodle.
Army surveillance has been the subject of public hearings in Congress, but little was known about FBI surveillance until last March, when a group of radicals broke into an FBI office in this building in Media, Pennsylvania, a Philadelphia suburb. The documents the radicals distributed afterward to the press and Congress indicated the scope of FBI surveillance of ghettos and college campuses. Traditionally, the college campus has been a place apart, a training ground for our young, a refuge for our men of ideas, a place where men and women could be free to advance and test new thoughts. But because new ideas, by definition, tend to be radical, and because campus demonstrations have occasionally turned violent, the government recently began widespread surveillance. The FBI has been ordered to keep a close watch on all campuses. We shall look at just one, Swarthmore College near Philadelphia. It is graduation day. Most of the members of the class of '71 admitted they were surprised. They'd talked a lot in the usual dormitory bull sessions about government snooping, but they were stunned by the headlines in their school newspaper. The document stolen from a nearby FBI office revealed the government, with the help of college employees, was compiling dossiers on the more active students, keeping an eye on a popular, though radical, professor. The graduates, who happened to be black, were somewhat less surprised. They say they're used to feeling different, expect to be watched, and the news that a list of black students had been given to the FBI only confirmed their view of how the government operates. But it wasn't at all what Jacqueline Royce might have expected. She's the daughter of a congressman from Wisconsin. Still, the FBI checked her out with the help of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. the police and sheriff's departments of 2 cities, even credit bureaus. Just why has never been explained, not even to her father, Congressman Henry Royce, who on this day came to Swarthmore to receive an honorary degree and to address the graduating class.
I have first to read a special message to you from someone who cannot be here today. Though I cannot be with you today, many of my friends are here. I want each and every one of you to know I'll be following you with intense interest always. J. Edgar Hoover.
Swarthmore manages to laugh now, but for many, it is a bitter laugh. What bothered Swarthmore most was that it had so willingly helped the FBI penetrate the campus, open its confidential records. Anxious to find government jobs for its graduates, Swarthmore's guidelines for releasing information were loosely drawn. FBI documents indicated the college registrar, the school police chief, even the telephone operator had supplied information. A student-faculty committee was appointed to find out how it had happened. We asked Professor David Smith whether the committee really knew the full extent of FBI surveillance on campus.
No, I don't think we really do, and that's one of the things that troubles us. I think that we felt pretty clearly that surveillance had taken place, that the FBI had attempted to recruit informants on the campus, that they had been maintaining a general surveillance of radical students and of black students, but we couldn't have proven a thing in a court of law.
What do you think, Professor Smith, has been the impact, the effect of all of this on the life of Swarthmore College?
Perhaps in long-run effect, not very great, but I think there's several things one ought to mention. For one thing, I think we've been made very conscious that we can't really trust government agencies to the same extent that we did before, where they make a routine check on employment, security. We've normally cooperated. We've felt, too, if you were dealing with the FBI, that if they were investigating something, it would either be a kind of routine employment check or it would be looking into a crime. Now, when they maintain a general surveillance, this makes you suspect with regard to the whole information gathering process. You wonder what kind of dossier this is going to appear in. What's the future history of a piece of information of that sort? So you tighten your guidelines, and you tend to be wary.
In the course of your investigation, did you talk to the Justice Department or to the FBI?
They wouldn't talk to us.
What explanation did they give?
They just said they weren't talking.
It is 12 miles from the reflective quiet of Swarthmore to the center of Philadelphia's black ghetto. But it is not a distance that can be measured in miles. The brutality of life affects everything, even surveillance. Surveillance is less subtle here. Everyone is suspect. Muhammad Kenyatta is a militant leader. He admits he's a revolutionary, a nonviolent one, he says, because to be anything else would be suicide. Kenyatta is being watched by both the police and the FBI. Government documents indicate that his phone is probably tapped, his checking account monitored, his organization infiltrated with informers. It is no surprise to Kenyatta that he is under surveillance, but he says all black leaders are watched.
These files from the Media FBI office contain not only the names of people like myself, people from the Black Panther Party. These files mention people from the Welfare Rights Organization, people from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Further, the files specifically talk about establishing a network of racial informants or ghetto informants that would include liquor store salesmen, that would include insurance collectors, that would include, of course, black students, a wholesale investigation of black students. So what we find is that black people from all walks of life in all kinds of organizations are being kept under surveillance.
The authorities say they must watch people like Muhammad Kenyatta. It is less clear why they must watch Mary Rouse. From a small clothing store, she runs the Kensington Self-Help Center, a neighborhood organization that tries to find jobs for young men.
It's just gone from one thing to the other, from stationary surveillance on my house in Center to moving surveillance of myself and people who visit my home, the censure of my mail, the tapping of my telephone, and all kind of threats, you know, when you can hear teletypes going in the back of the conversation.
Well, Mrs. Rouse, with all these surveillance activities, have you ever been arrested?
I've never been arrested, no.
Do you consider yourself a person who wants to overthrow the Constitution and the government?
If I were a person who wanted to overthrow the government and start riots and whatnot, I would not spend the majority of my time on the street talking to young men who believe in off the pig and this kind of thing. That's not my thing at all. I'm not concerned about a new constitution. I just want to make certain the one we have work and that I get my fair share.
One of the places the police and the FBI watch most closely is the Episcopal Church of the Advocate, where we talked with Father Paul Washington.
We have had any number of meetings here where police cars have been parked at the entrances, where people who have left carrying flyers and mimeographed material have been taken into automobiles, their materials taken away from them, and then they have just been released in a few blocks away without any kind of charge.
Well, according to reports, the Church of the Advocate and some other organizations are on a list of known or suspected black extremist organizations. Are they extremist organizations?
I would not see them as being extreme. As far as we are concerned, as long as there is the unemployment, as long as there is the kind of discrimination and segregation existing in the black community, as long as in our jails you have from 85 to 90% of the inmates being black, as long as the schools are poor as they are poor, then we just don't see how working to change these conditions can be looked upon as activities of extremist groups.
We took what we had learned of political surveillance in Philadelphia to Washington for the government's perspective. The Justice Department coordinates intelligence gathering operations. And Assistant Attorney General Robert Mardian insisted surveillance is designed to meet the earlier criticism of the Warren, Scranton, and Kerner commissions.
There's been criticism of so-called political surveillance, as you put it. I recall most recently the charge by a very prominent senator that he was being surveilled at an Earth Day rally. He chose to characterize it in that fashion. The purpose of having two bureau agents there was not to surveil the Earth Day rally or this particular senator, but to do exactly what these various commissions have recommended, to prevent a situation such as occurred in Los Angeles with the assassination of Senator Kennedy. You may recall the outcry of public criticism that Senator Kennedy was not protected. Well, Senator Kennedy was at a political rally. So in this area, it seems that the government's damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. It's a very, very sensitive area, a very difficult area. One which places upon the government a tremendous burden, that of measuring, on the one hand, the need to protect the president, the need to avoid violent civil disorder, and at the same time, not to do it in such a fashion that it impinges upon the First Amendment rights of the people involved in the rally or demonstration.
Mr. Mardian, does the government conduct political surveillance? Does it care what people say or think?
Not in the context in which you've asked the question. I know of no instance where the government, any government agency, has embarked on a program on a continuous basis or for any limited period of time even, for the purpose of determining what the political views of an individual or a group of individuals are as such.
How would you explain this attitude among demonstrators, that they're being watched, that Washington has files on them?
I don't know what to attribute it to other than a paranoia that is fed by, quite frankly, this type of interview we're having today. The fact that you're asking the questions and the fact that I'm answering them is going to lead to a dichotomy amongst the people that view the program as to whether or not I'm telling the truth or not. There are numerous people who are convinced, for instance, that their telephones are tapped. It just isn't happening. I can say that with some great deal of assurance because I happen to know. I would add that not only a paranoia, but a monumental ego is involved when some political dissident claims that, one, he's under surveillance, or two, that his telephone is tapped. Ninety-nine and a half percent of the work of the FBI is, for instance, is engaged in tracking down criminals. That's their job. They're an investigatory agency. To my knowledge, they do not engage in any type of political surveillance.
But on Capitol Hill, Senator Sam Ervin, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, says there is too much surveillance. Ervin is the Senate's conservative expert on the Constitution. He might be classified a strict constructionist.
It'd be an intolerable country to live in if the government could investigate everybody and put them under surveillance merely because sometime during their life in the future they might commit some crime. That would be the establishment of a police state. I don't think government has the right to put any man under surveillance unless they have a reason to believe he has committed a crime or is about to commit a crime. And I think the best thing to do is let people dissent. I think it's good for two reasons. In the first place, if a dissent is justified, and often is, it will lead to the correction of the conditions out of which the dissent grows. And if dissent is not justified, it certainly relieves the tension of the dissenters, and in either event, it has a therapeutic value for society.
Senator Ervin, we went to Philadelphia looking for examples of surveillance. We found a number of examples. How prevalent do you think it is in the country as a whole?
Oh, I think it's rather pervasive throughout the United States in one form or another.
Is this something we should care about? Is it so pervasive that we should worry about it?
Yes, because I think that when government watches people, that it frightens people into a reluctance to exercise their First Amendment rights. A person is not going to go out and petition for redress of grievances, at least most of them are not, if they think the government's spying on them and making a record of their presence at a rally to protest the policy of government. Unfortunately, a lot of people are not too courageous, and the First Amendment was made for the timid as well as for the brave.
Surveillance affects more than just the young, the black, the politically active. It can touch others who least expect it. For instance, the people who live in this house, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Link. They asked us not to take their picture, but like others, Mrs. Link says she became concerned about sex education in the schools. Like others, in response to a magazine advertisement, she sent $1 to a post office box number for a pamphlet. What Mrs. Link did not know is that blind post office box was an address for the Ku Klux Klan. Nor could she know that her check for $1 went into an account monitored by the FBI. The Links were thoroughly investigated. Employment history, credit rating, even voting records. All that information and more funneled into an FBI dossier. Still, officials claim there's no damage really. They say their files are confidential, never used. A claim we decided to examine. The file on a typical Philadelphian may start here in school. A number of agencies have access to school records, and once those records leave school, they're easily available. Grades, psychological test results may turn up in the hands of anyone from a potential employer to the federal government. If you had an emotional problem in the 5th grade or a disciplinary problem in the 7th grade, that information could be in a file somewhere, waiting. Even if you've never had problems in school with the police, there is still probably a background file on you with information available to almost anyone who wants to take the trouble to look. Anytime you buy a car, apply for insurance, or a job, you may touch off an investigation into your private life. Detectives not only trying to learn about your credit rating, but who your friends are, where you travel, whether you go to church. The information pours into the files of local credit bureaus. The largest, Retail Credit Company Incorporated, maintains files on 45 million Americans. Its 8,000 agents, they prefer to call themselves field representatives, interview 200,000 people every day. At the Atlanta headquarters of the organization, we talked with its president, W. Lee Burge.
Mr. Burge, would you say that at some point in my life that one of your agencies has investigated me?
I would not know, but if you have bought on credit, if you have bought automobile insurance or life insurance, then the chances are good that we might have investigated you at one time or another.
What do you view as the proper relationship between yourself and law enforcement agencies?
If they come to us and ask us for former addresses, former employers, or other identification that might be beneficial to them in an investigation they are conducting, we do cooperate with them, and we think we should as a matter of our public responsibility.
Have you ever had any contracts with investigative agencies of the government?
Nothing except with the FBI, where they might pay us for the use of a file for leads, such as we talked about a moment ago.
Are you as concerned as some people are about this vision of Big Brother, that someone may bring together all of this information and destroy freedom?
Well, I'm concerned about Big Brother, but I construe Big Brother as being big government. Because there are, upon private enterprise, many restraints that are not upon government. I am not worried about any private company becoming Big Brother unless it were commandeered by government and abused by government in some way or another.
Credit bureaus, the police, the FBI, all insist their files are confidential. But as we have seen, not necessarily confidential from each other. Once information, correct or incorrect, finds its way into a file someplace, it may turn up somewhere else. And while the authorities claim those files are never used to hurt anyone, there's a man in Philadelphia who disputes that. 123 South Broad is one of the best addresses in the city's financial district. The address of the law offices of Richardson Dilworth, one of the city's wealthiest and most influential citizens. Former mayor, director of a bank, until recently president of the school board, and leader of the establishment or not, still the subject of a police dossier, compiled, he says, by then-Commissioner Rizzo.
The police, under the commissioner, collected dossiers, I'd say, on thousands of citizens. He has boasted in meetings, one of the meetings with us, that he had his complete files on the people as Mr. J. Edgar Hoover does. At one of our school board meetings, where the mayor insisted the police commissioner be present, toward the end of the meeting, the commissioner very ostentatiously threw a number of files on the table and said, I've got enough on every one of you, pointing at us.
Meaning who?
Meaning the members of the Board of Education, to run you out of the city.
Well, what was your reaction to that?
Our reaction was not to say a single word. We just looked at him in absolute silence, some astonishment.
Well, do you believe that those files that he threw on the desk were, in fact, files on you and some of your fellow school board members?
I think they were, yes. I'm sure he's got a file on every school board member.
Did he threaten to use these files in an attempt to influence your vote?
No, I think this was just to make it plain to us that unless we sort of fell in line and ceased criticism of the commissioner and his methods in the schools, that we would regret it.
Although another member of the school board privately confirms Dilworth's story, Rizzo insists it's not true.
Absolutely never happened. And ask Mr. Dilworth to present witnesses that were there when this occurred. And I'll face Mr. Dilworth anywhere, any place, any time. Just not so, Dave. Never happened.
Rizzo went on to confirm that the authorities do trade information and conceded that there are people in police files who may not belong there.
But unfortunately, I agree to some degree that if some person is at a picket site or at a site of a demonstration, that the cameras are, used, and we come up with photographs and names of people, etc. That maybe that should not be. And I think that maybe one day there'll have to be a little homework done and maybe go through the files and remove from the files some of these people who felt strongly against the war, who felt strongly against certain other things, but by no stretch of the imagination made them a criminal or a suspected criminal, or would by any way indicate that they were disloyal to our government.
There are files, then, on people who have done nothing wrong. Files, perhaps, on you or the family next door. There was a file on Norman Shore, who became the subject of an FBI dossier when he was just 14, because he spent a summer at an international youth camp in East Germany. The invitation came to Norman and a group of other boys at a time when Norman's father was teaching in Africa. Herbert Shore is an international theater director. His wife, Michalina, was born in Holland. The Shores told of learning through the media FBI documents released to the press that they were under surveillance, that agents were reading the letters they wrote their son, looking for some hidden code in phrases like, "Mom is feeling better."
We wrote to him regularly, both of us. We probably saved him a lot of trouble on surveillance because a good deal of what we wrote were written on postcards, on picture postcards. He wanted picture postcards so that he could pass around pictures of the States to people. And several letters that I wrote apparently were read and excerpted or summarized and so on. Among them, letters which I wrote about Michalina's health, because when Norman left, Michalina was not in very good shape. She had just recovered or was recovering from a very, very serious case of tapeworm, an astoundingly long tapeworm. And Norm worried about it, and I wrote to him and said that he didn't have to worry, that Mom was recovering well, and that emotionally she was over having a tapeworm is a kind of ghastly thing, even emotionally.
Mom was feeling better wasn't a code then for something else.
No, it was not. It was a distinct code for the fact that Norman's mother was feeling very well, and that he didn't have to worry about her anymore.
Mrs. Shore, you were born in Holland. What's your reaction to what's happened to you and your family in this country?
I was amazed that mail was being opened. But then we were sitting down at lunchtime at the kitchen table, and Norman sits across from my husband and me. And all of a sudden, something came back into my mind. When the Second World War started, I was younger than Norman, but my mother sat across the table from me one day. It was the first day of the war. And she said to me, "I'm awfully sorry. I had hoped that in your life you wouldn't have to go through through war." So when I was watching Norm, the same thing came to my mind, except this time it was not an enemy that was invading a country like the Germans did to Holland. But this time it was his own fellow Americans who were spying on him. And this feeling, just brought me back 5 years of war, 5 years of suppression by people who well, don't like what you're doing.
So there is surveillance in Philadelphia, and if not on the scale of Orwell's 1984, still a good deal of it. It's prompted a new word in our vocabularies, if not our dictionaries, to surveil, a verb. It is political surveillance in the sense that it's directed mostly at those who disagree with the government. But in private and public files, there are dossiers on most of the rest of us as well. If there's not yet a vast computer network in Philadelphia or anywhere else, the FBI is planning a nationwide computer system that will tap into local police files. Today, it's popular to blame J. Edgar Hoover, or the police, or the Republicans. But we've also concluded that surveillance is apolitical, or at least bipartisan. There are those who say that new laws or new political leadership will end the abuses. We expect a great deal from our leaders and from our laws, and less of ourselves. We began by saying the subject was surveillance. It may have been more than that. It may have been about what happens to a city and a country when its people stop trusting each other. This is David Shoemaker for CBS Reports. Good night.